So React Query is something that took me way too long to understand and way too long to understand why I was using it and why I should care. So today I want to break down what it actually does for you and why you should be using it and the sort of benefits you get from using React Query. And I want to illustrate this with a little demo I threw together. A few days ago, I built out a MongoDB server that does CRUD operations on books. So I just use this as a data source. So I built out this site that can just fetch all these books, and then I did all this data fetching with React Query. So let's start with the code in here. So this is the home page. On the home page, this is just standard React code down here, nothing special. The interesting part is up here with this use query. So this use query is where it gets interesting. So if you are at all familiar with what React Query is and does, it's a way for you to query your data, so fetch it from a server or some external source, and it's also a way for you to mutate that data on that source, or it's basically send a post request. So in the code, I have this use query hook. So this use query hook is going to take in a couple arguments. First thing it's going to take in is the query key. I'll get back to that in a moment. The next thing it's going to take in is the query function, and then this is how I'm going to actually fetch all of this data. So you just pass in some asynchronous function that returns some data. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm saying console.log that it's fetching. Again, I'll get into that later. Then I'm just doing a fetch to localhost 8080 and then getting the JSON down, typing it, and then returning it. So nothing too special there, but something to note is that React Query implements all the nice TypeScript stuff you would have. So if we hover over book, we get this interface, and then if I hover over data, it's either going to have data where data is a book array, or it's going to have undefined. So it gives you all that TypeScript type safety right out of the box, makes it really nice to work with as long as you type your data within the fetch function, which I did here. You go ahead, you type your data, you get your query function, then we have this stale time down here. And I guess this is the point where I'll get into one of the big things that React Query will do for you, and that is caching. Whenever you initialize React Query, you do this thing up here where you add this query client provider, and then you pass in this client of query client. I had zero clue what this did for a very long time, and what this is actually doing is this is allowing you to effectively have a global cache state within your app. So since you're wrapping your component wrapper, so you're wrapping your entire app in this query client provider, that means that anywhere you go, any page you go, you can then access, under the hood, React Query can access that shared global state, and it can effectively add global caching to your site. Now, you don't need to worry about how that's implemented or how that actually works. All you need to know is that this is how it's actually handling giving you that cache. So in here, when I have this query key, this key is saying, okay, this query is going to be keyed in with this. So it's effectively a key value pair of whatever data I get down from this function, whatever data I get down from this query function, we're going to store it within the cache, and the key is going to be all books. And then the stale time is going to be in milliseconds. So I have 1,000 milliseconds right here, which is equivalent to a second. So 1 second times 60 is a minute, times 2 is 2 minutes. So this means that every 2 minutes, this data is going to get stale, and it's going to need to refetch it. So what the stale time is effectively saying is that every 2 minutes, we're going to need to refetch the data of the query with the key of all books. But as long as that data is not stale, then it will not have to refetch it. If we go to a different page, it won't actually execute that fetching request. So I created this cache page, which is exactly the same. It does basically the exact same thing. It has this use query, same key, and it has this same method up here. And the key thing to note is this get all books fetching thing. So let's illustrate how this actually works in the browser. So if we go here, we are on the home page. And if I refresh this, we're going to get all books fetching. So that means that it just did a fresh fetch from the external API. So that query function just got called. Now if we go to the cache page, you're going to see it did not print this again. And that's because this was being loaded out of the cache. But if we go ahead and refresh this page, we're going to get this get all books fetching again. So we're going to get that again. But if we go back to our home page, we're not going to get it again. So anytime we go back and forth between these two pages, we're not going to have to refetch that unless we get to the end of the stale duration. So to illustrate that stale duration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the home page, and I'm going to just set this to be 1 second. This data is going to go stale after a second. It's not going to last long. So what we can just do is if we go on the home page and I refresh, I'm going to refresh this real quick. So we've done one fetch, and now if we go to the cache page, it's going to have to fetch again. And then if we go back to the home page, it's going to have to fetch again. Go back to the cache, it's going to have to fetch again, and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. It's going to be stale, so it's not going to be pulling it out of the cache. So hopefully this illustrates the idea that effectively what React Query is going to do for you is it's going to give you global caching, so that if you say pull down the user's details or something in the nav bar, and you do that under like fetch user query or something like that, then that will be cached, and if you need to use that query somewhere else, it'll happen instantly because that data won't be stale, and you'll have it cached within your servers. Another thing that this will do for you is it'll obviously obviously give you these really nice handlers to work with React in the way sort of React works. It'll pass out these state variables of data, is loading, error, and a couple other really nice ones. You can use these to actually display your data or to do some like check states. So on here I have like an is loading variable. So if my function is loading, then it's going to tell me that it's loading, and then I won't accidentally display undefined data. And then my data is strongly typed, error if you get an error, so on and so forth. So it gives you a ton of other really nice wrapper things that you can use to improve the way you actually work with the data within your app. So yeah, so use query. It's a way to fetch the data. It's a nice way to work with it in the actual component, and it gives you global caching. So now let's take a look at the mutations. So over here, I did a basic mutation example, and all that's going to do is just make a fetch request to this URL as a post request, pass in some JSON, so on and so forth. Nothing too crazy here. So the interesting stuff comes in when we look down here. So there are a couple things that are happening here. So the first thing we're doing is we're calling use mutation. So a mutation is something that's going to actually change the state of our server or send some data, change the state of our server. So what we're going to do is we're going to do mutation function and then create book. That I defined up here is just doing an external asynchronous call. Now, if you notice in here, I'm passing in an argument here of endBook because I need to pass in a new book to actually post to the server. And I'm not doing that in here. I'm just passing in the function. So to actually call this mutation, we have to call createBookMutation.mutate and then pass in as an argument that data. So down here, I'm passing in endBook, which has the correct type. So I'm saying mutate on that object. So we mutate that, we go ahead, so that's what the mutation does. Then I'm adding another thing here, which is an onSuccess function. So this function will fire whenever we have successfully called this mutation. So if we've successfully called this mutation, that means that we have successfully put a new book on our server. Now we need to update our UI on the client. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call queryClient.invalidateQueries all books. So if you remember back here, I had these things of all books. So I'm going to go ahead and switch those back to normal. So they're going to have long stale times, so just going back and forth between the pages wouldn't refresh them. If we look here, we're on our cache, we go to create, and then we go back. It's not going to actually fetch again. So what we can do is then go onto this create page, and we can invalidate this query, which means that it's now going to instantly be stale. So the next time we make a call to that query, it's going to have to fully refetch it. So we're going to get that fresh data down from the server. And the reason why I'm able to do this is because I'm calling this query client, and then use query client, and then that is going to... Since this whole thing is wrapped in that component at the top level, it's going to have access to all this stuff, and it can just pass it down via context, which is really, really nice. So we get this query client, then we invalidate this query, and then I'm just going to redirect us to the home page to illustrate the data being updated. So on our create page, what we can do is I will go to the home page. So I will go home. We just fetched some new data. Now let's go to create. This will be video, video, video. And then if we create this, it's going to refetch this, and then down at the bottom here, we're going to have another video. So hopefully that sort of shows you what a mutation can do and the way you can actually invalidate these queries to refetch the data in a really pretty easy way to actually manage. So that's kind of the point. It's cache management, and then these mutations are just a really nice wrapper for these actual server-side calls, because this create book mutation also exposes some stuff like create book mutation dot is loading. So we get an is loading, is error, is idle, is paused, is success, so on and so forth. So we get all of these state variables that we can pull out, and then we can update our UI to show how this is working in a very natural way based on those different fields. This saves us a lot of time, because if you didn't do that, you would have to set up like a sort of use effect thing where whenever they submit, you would then need to have loading variables in there that would then, you would just have to do all this state setup yourself. So this just does all of it, wraps it out of the box, and makes your life way easier. So in my opinion, the main use case for React Query is basically anytime you have a fairly interactive website where you need to be fetching tons of different data in tons of different places, and you're not static building stuff, use React Query. It will make your life so much easier. And yeah, remember the caching, remember the mutations, remember the loading, and that's about it.